Welcome everyone to this webinar on 3D models and rights management. My name is Ariadna Matas. I work as a policy advisor at the Europeana Foundation, and I'll just be doing a quick introduction before I hand it over to our speakers for today. This webinar is actually an excuse and has been organized with the main goal of raising awareness about a study that we're launching today that has been recently published, entitled 3D Models and Rights Management. It's a report on copyright, but also on other rights assessments for 3D models, mostly focused on Europeana, conducted by Dr. Andrea Wallace and Dr. Francesca Farmer. You'll find it available in the emails that you received when registering for this event, but also you can check it out on that link or go to Europeana Pro, and if you type the name of the report, you will find it easily. And it's a report that was commissioned by a working group at Europeana that works on data governance. So it's a working group that gathers people from the Europeana Network Association, the Europeana Foundation, and the European Aggregators Forum that is looking at some questions around data governance. So we're looking at how to put in place certain additional or change, review some of the rules that we have in place. So how to review these rules, establish some practices and processes for use cases that are relatively new in the Europeana and the data space. And so the reason why this group wanted to commission such a report, and you'll be hearing more about the report in just a moment, was that it's become clear that Europeana and the data space for cultural heritage is going to be giving access, or has the intention of giving access to more and more 3D models. If you're familiar with the 2021 recommendations from the European Commission to member states on cultural heritage data space, on a common European data space for cultural heritage, you'll see that there's very high targets for increasing the amount of 3D material available via the data space of Europeana. So it's clear that we're at the beginning of making available a lot more 3D models. So it's a great time to be looking at how to do things right and to follow a process that is sustainable and correct in the future. And as part of this group, we really wanted to understand one of the key questions around this, which is around copyright and other legal areas, especially when it comes to expressing the reuse conditions of these 3D models. As you might know, in the context of Europeana, the approach we follow at the moment is to rely on data providers to assign a rights statement or Creative Commons license or tool to every digital object that they make available via Europeana. And the choice of rights statement or Creative Commons license or tool is really dependent on having an understanding of whether any copyright and other legal or contractual restrictions exist in mostly the underlying object, but possibly also the model, so the digital reproduction. So we're not talking about something completely new, but we wanted to have a better understanding about the specificities that 3D models brought in that in this conversation. So to what extent, especially that's one of the key questions, to what extent would some data providers be claiming that there are rights in the model separate from the rights that might exist or might no longer exist on the underlying object? Not that it's something we would encourage to recognize. On the contrary, if those who created the 3D model also have the rights, potential rights on this, could always release these rights, but we still wanted to have clarity on the extent to which rights might arise or not, in order to then guide data providers into choosing the most accurate right statement and therefore facilitate reuse in a way that is accurate. So we're hoping that this report will provide guidance to those providing data to Europeana, but I think it can also be super useful to any other cultural heritage organization engaging with 3D digitization methods and grappling with some of the legal background around this. You'll hear from Andrea about some key insights in the report, and for me, the thing that I find the most relevant, especially to guide all of you interested in this topic, is to focus on the parameters and the mechanism that it defines for us to do things right going forward. And I think that's a really crucial thing that the report is bringing. So today you'll be hearing from two people, Dr. Andrea Wallace, Associate Professor of Law and Technology at the University of Exeter Law School, also working at the GLAM eLab, and also super active at Europeana's Copyright Community Steering Group. Andrea has published numerous research pieces in the area of cultural heritage, copyright, some other legal areas, and especially when it comes to intersection between the digital world and the public domain. And she'll be telling you about the report she's conducted and about some of the key highlights in this report. And then we're also really lucky to have with us Merete Sanderhoff, who's a curator and senior advisor of digital museum practice at the National Gallery of Denmark. And Merete will be, she's been really active in the Europeana spectrum, from the Members Council at the Europeana Network Association to the advisory board at the Europeana Foundation. And she'll be able to show us a specific case study that brings into practice some of the insights that Andrea will be sharing on how to embrace open access in the context of 3D digitization projects, and how to still explore areas where the organization can get some revenue, but not placing additional copyright restrictions when they're not necessary or not pertinent. So I would recommend that everyone drops questions in the chat if you've got very pressing questions, but we would like to take all of them at the end so that we can have a conversation on the basis of the two presentations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Great, thank you so much, Ariadna. So yeah, I think that the way we kind of see our respective conversations happening today is that, I'm really going to open the door for what the data tells us about practices, how people are interpreting copyright and other legal rights that might arise during the creation of a 3D model, and also how they're marking them when they publish them in online spaces. But that kind of being a way for us to reorient and think a little bit differently about the different actions that happen, all the way up to the decision to mark the model itself with a license. Because what I want your takeaway to be is not that none of that is creative, or that certain pieces of it don't attract copyright. But when we're talking about complex media, and when we're looking at what European law and policy clearly tells us should be the direction going forward, we really need to be thinking differently about that initial assumption that copyright does in fact arise, that something is sufficiently original. And we are going to look at some of the guidance and some of the kind of the updates to law and policy currently in place that should give us a little bit more background about how we approach that. And then Merete is going to tell you about how basically the SMK has been adopting this approach and thinking differently about copyright and open access, even before Article 14, even before, these policy statements. The sky hasn't fallen, and instead it's opened up a lot of opportunity to do the things that we actually think copyright should be doing for the institution, bringing different forms of revenue, creating, new opportunities, and bringing people into the space in a way that really does expand what it is that the mission is doing and what it is that the institution is achieving, but what copyright really is not doing for us currently, okay? So with that, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what I'm going to call the kind of the backbone, the pieces that should help you when you go and you read the report, okay? I'm not going to do a super extensive deep dive into the report, but I am going to kind of give you what that critical lens is that you should have when you go and you read it. Ariadna provided some of the information around this, but we really wanted to understand what the IP landscape was and what GLAM practices are with respect to 3D models. So, part of the goal there was to think like, what is the potential of or for 3D models in the data space? Thinking about the Common Cloud for Cultural Heritage, all the important ways that cultural data can be used by SMEs, and the things that, we want to see happen with objects that are in the public domain. We're also going to look at some of the specific legal frameworks and rights management practices that shape that potential. In some ways, they help institutions fulfill that potential. In other ways, it operates to sometimes impede that potential. But we're also going to look at the data around what the current situation is on Europeana, what rights statements are being applied to 3D models, and whether or not, according to the methodology that we used, we found that to be accurate. And lastly, we do make some kind of key recommendations about the role that Europeana can play as a really trusted provider in this space, but also as one that operates its own kind of licensing framework and data model, and a way that can help kind of standardize what it is that we're doing going forward, building trust with GLAMs, with multiple people who are in this space, and improving access, sharing, and reusability of cultural heritage data. Next slide, please. So let's just start by looking at specifically the legal framework we need to keep in mind when we look at a work that's in the public domain and we determine whether or not the reproduction media that's generated around that work is eligible for either related rights or copyrights once it's produced in the form of a 3D model, okay? Article 14 in European case law tells us that there's actually 3 crucial things. This is how I break it down to help us kind of walk through it and see it as cumulative in the process of identifying a work that's sufficiently original. And we can think of, for example, a distinction between creating something kind of from scratch or as inspiration. Brent is going to give you some great examples of those a little bit later, as being very different from a cultural heritage perspective of creating a reproduction of an existing object or site that is intended to be used for research, for education, to share what the actual source object looks like and the information that it contains to the public, okay? So this is where this kind of 3-step cumulative approach to assessing copyright becomes useful. So we have to first know that scope has to arrive for creative choices to be made during the reproduction of an object with 3D reproduction, okay? But just because there is scope for creative choices to be taken does not mean that creative choices are in fact made. Quite often when we're thinking about the reproduction of cultural heritage objects, there are various and sometimes strenuous things that occur in the process of reproducing something, but those are technical, right? They're not creative. They don't result in something being stylized in the process. It is a different sort of process, and that creativity that copyright rewards doesn't necessarily come in when it comes to the end result. There may be lots of creative things that happen, the way that you set up some of your technology, the way that you design your workflow, and if that happens, of course, those specific aspects of the process may receive copyright protection, but does the copyright therefore then attach to the model itself? Okay, this is a question that we should be asking when we take the approach of assessing the model as separate from all of the work that goes into the production of the model. And so that process, of course, this is the third point, it has to result in that 3D model itself being the author's own intellectual creation, such that the model is imprinted with the technician's personal touch, okay? That means it is a new original expression. It's not a faithful reproduction of the underlying work. It is a new original expression that exists and receives a separate copyright protection in itself. Something that's really key, of course, to keep in mind here is that we have lots of case law that tells us technical labor, decisions, financial investments, all of the time and energy that goes into creating something does not in and of itself justify a copyright. It has to be creative, and it also has to produce the creative and original expression, okay? So where this actually starts to intersect with how we view 3D models and we interpret them aesthetically, there's a lot of technology out there that might be outdated. We might be restricted by our own ability to operate, the software or the specific ways in which, we're reproducing the work. And aesthetically, it might look a little different. But again, is there an actual creative decision that was taken that results in that model being something that's separate and distinct, or is it the limitations of the individual or the technology that's used in place? And this is something that we really stress needs to be considered when we're thinking about whether or not a copyright arises. Okay, next slide, please. So a really kind of key thing that we try to point out here is why this matters for cultural heritage objects and sites. There's this irony that comes through, which tells us the more that someone invests in trying to make a model look accurate, right, the less likely it is to be original because it's trying to reproduce an existing expression or even an object itself that was never eligible for copyright protection when we're thinking about archaeological sites and landscapes. So the more original the model, by contrast, the less useful that model becomes for study and other purposes that require reliable data and accuracy. And why this is also important is it plays directly into the methodology and the way that we approached assessing the models for the actual study. So next slide, please. So in terms of our methodology, we took both quantitative and qualitative research approaches to understanding what is happening, okay? We started from a position, a legal position that exists, that no new copyrights or related rights arise in faithful 3D models of existing cultural heritage objects and sites. And that is because that's what the law tells us. We then did a strategic review of almost 5,000 3D models to kind of reverse engineer the model's production and determine whether or not the license or statement that was assigned to the model actually squared with the way that copyright law tells us it should be interpreted. And so what we essentially did, to give you an idea, is in some cases, there was a specific provider that published 400 data models. We could see that a consistent license was applied across all of those models. We then looked into those models to see, oh, these are largely just reproductions of archaeological objects that are intended to be faithful. And where there was a license applied to it, we were able to say all of those models are actually inaccurately assessed as being protected by copyright, okay? Now, there were variable approaches too, and sometimes that's because institutions published a range of objects or archaeological sites, or sometimes things were very clearly born digital or reconstructions. And so when we saw variable approaches, we did more of an in-depth review to understand, either in a categorical or some other basis, whether or not the individual model assessments were correct. And after that, we then assigned a status as to whether or not those assessments were accurate, inaccurate, questionable, which meant actually probably copyright arises, but in fact, we don't have enough information to know, or unknown. And sometimes that was because of broken links or other sorts of kind of obstructions that prevented us from making a conclusion. And what's really important, to think about here is the fact that we relied on the institution's own presentation of that model to inform how we interpreted copyright. So it was the description, the metadata, the paradata. We would also trace back to the institutional source website any papers, any sort of research, or things that have been published about the process to really understand whether or not it was creative or it accurately represented the source. But we also undertook interviews, we did specific case studies, and of course, the report goes into more detail about doctrinal and other in-depth analysis. So next slide, please. Now, of course, every study is going to have its limitations, but we want you to approach this with an understanding that our analyses are first and foremost grounded in prevailing EU laws and policies, okay? So where those limitations arise in terms of our ability or inability to assess the model itself, it's quite often because, as we find in the study, organizations are not disclosing beyond basic metadata, paradata, or other descriptions what makes a model sufficiently original and therefore distinct and different from the source work, okay? Again, that is an issue when we're thinking about the reason for which these models are created and our ability to understand maybe what's been interpreted versus what is typically historical or accurate or representative of the source object. But organizations themselves also lack legal expertise on copyright and the public domain, as well as contract, data, privacy, and so on. And quite often, that assumption that copyright arises is the first step that happens in the process. And that copyright also becomes convenient when we have concerns about data protection or privacy, or even sometimes, indigenous knowledge, because the assumption is that people will see the copyright and they won't use the work. Instead, they'll go to the institution for permission. The institution themselves can give context about what's appropriate and what's not. But copyright doesn't actually achieve those things for us, right? So I think there's this lack of legal expertise that also informs the default approach of assigning a copyright in the first place. And then, of course, as researchers, we had limited access to the source work to be able to compare the model to the source work. But what we could do, was look into the institutional collection, try to find other sorts of imagery, even those were 2D photographs that helped us understand. And we tried to map where copyright might arise in the process of reproduction, as is shown on the next slides. But of course, that can get very complicated. So next slide, please. So for example, this is a specific case study that we kind of dig into and we list in one of our scenario tables, where we're looking at a born digital reconstruction that involves composite data, scientific and expressive interpretation, and other potentially creative decisions and input. So the model itself was made using pictorial, photographic, technical documentation, including a combination of inventory of wind structures with these 3D scans, which are on the Market Square. But there was also research conducted in libraries and archives to prepare this virtual model of what this 1920s, 1930s town would have looked like. So the 3D modeling that took place around this, those are the things that were contributed to really build the virtual model. And in this case, we assess the copyright claim to be accurate because it is very likely to be sufficiently original. Now, that, of course, is very different from going back to a public domain work through which we try to make a representational 3D model. So next slide, please. This is where we really tried to help people understand what it is that our own process was, but also what their process should be when they're deciding whether a decision within that scope of creation is technical or is creative. And there's a couple of ways, that you kind of want to approach this. You want to be thinking about decisions made through pre-production selection processes, the actual production, and then of course during post-production. And there's different activities as well as kind of technical descriptions or creative descriptions about what the distinction would be between something that is technical versus something that really does result in something that is stylized and diverges from the source object. So we have these decision matrices in there to help people understand our own methodology, but also to help people make their own kind of assessments when they're thinking about if copyright arises and if so, when. Next slide, please. We've also produced these scenario tables. So after going through all of the models, we kind of identified these 5 areas where there were clusters, where we felt we could kind of group the different types of things that we're seeing. One of which was where there was probably a very clear public domain status in the 3D model, but that may or may not have been represented in the work. So we gave our reasoning behind kind of the assessment and whether or not the actual statement that was applied to that model was accurate. We then have a cluster where there's a little bit of a less clear copyright status. And sometimes that might be because the object itself is arranged in a creative way. Therefore, the expression in terms of the reproduction of that creative expression would be protected by copyright. We then had, layers of data or things where we had less clear right statuses. After that comes complex scans or reproductions. And then lastly, things that are very, very clearly protected by copyright: animations, composites, born digital reconstructions, or derivative works. And so we try to kind of escalate, where it's more likely for copyright to arise so that people could also think about where their models fall into some of these scenarios. And they could actually go through that kind of analysis process to see whether or not, their own model should be sufficiently original. Next slide, please. And all of this, of course, comes from our survey of all the models that were available on 3D or on Europeana. So some of the high-level data on this, there's 4,696. 93% of those models are subject to new copyright claims. And 6.7 are marked as public domain. Another 0.3% used a copyright disclaimer that prohibited commercial use. But when we went through the models that were subject to new copyright claims, we found that approximately 75% of those were subject to assertions that were probably not warranted. And so what that really means is that data providers are either misinterpreting copyright law, or from the researcher's perspective and from the user and general public perspective, they're failing to disclose what makes the model sufficiently original, which is relevant information that all of us need to have if we're going to be looking at and studying the model. So also, if copyright does arise, those rights and sometimes other rights are not actually accurately reflected in the model itself. So there might be rights in, for example, annotations and the ways that they're arranged and the descriptions that are within those annotations. But it doesn't mean that the model itself should be subject to a blanket copyright license. So we really try to tease out some of these examples as well so that people understand, if I think I do have copyright in these statements, that's what I need to clarify should not be violated if in fact I think it's of value, right, to claim and enforce those rights. Then lastly, one of the reasons this is really important is because when you look at the 2D digitizations of public domain works on Europeana, 30% of them are released to the public domain compared to the 6.7% of 3D models. Now, in theory, there's greater scope for copyright to rise when we're thinking about what the 3D model is doing and achieving. But at the same time, if the goal is to make a faithful reproduction, that copyright assessment is exactly the same. The technologies may have changed. There may be more steps and time and resources involved, but we're really looking to see whether the output is a new original expression or not, right? And that's what we need to be keeping in mind. Okay, next slide, please. So just quickly, I'll show you a couple of graphs. The distribution of statements that are applied to 3D models was also really interesting to look at a more granular level. So of the copyright statements that are applied, which are closed licenses, and what that means is they're licenses that prohibit modification or commercial use, we can see that the most popular Creative Commons license that's used is actually its most restrictive. It's the CC BY NC ND license, which is applied to almost 2,000 models, or over 40% of the models that are on Europeana. By contrast, we do have about 200 that are published under open licenses. So those are licenses that permit commercial use and modification, but you have to have a copyright in order to apply one of those licenses in the first place, right? So we do see practices where people really want attribution. They want to be cited as the source of the data, but also the host of the object. But you cannot use a copyright-based license to achieve that. And in fact, both Europeana and Creative Commons have really wonderful guidance about how to encourage attribution instead of using a copyright license that's neither enforceable nor appropriate. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this is just a breakdown of kind of the accuracy of the right statements. You can see, kind of the distribution of what those looked like across the inaccurate, accurate, questionable, and unknown categories. And there's a whole section that goes into more detail and even highlights different collections that take kind of variable approaches. So I would really encourage you to go and read the report and the data on that. Next slide. So the last thing that I'll leave you with is that copyright is not going to save us. There are very strong and clear desires to create and generate revenue for an institution for a very kind of costly project or these sorts of things, so that we can continue to do the work that cultural institutions are doing and that they are significantly underfunded for. But copyright licensing is a very narrow approach when you think about all of the other sorts of business models that are out there. And even if copyright arises, the question is it in the model? Is it in some of the other composite data? Can we still publish the model while commercializing that aspect of the creative process? And because we're talking about complex media here, there is a very specific license called CC0 that allows you to disclaim copyright. You don't have to enforce copyright even if it arises. So there is an option available there as well. But we're also seeing that maintaining copyright and exclusivity over the models themselves is not needed to commercialize them, okay? There's a lot of different ways that we can go about doing this. whether that's through service fee models, derivative models, or other methods that reduce access and reuse barriers for the general public while still producing income for organizations who make these models. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of other restrictions that are valid when it comes to cultural concerns, sensitivity, data protection, but copyright itself is not the tool to protect the heritage, right? We need to be thinking about different licenses, labels, or even whether publication is appropriate and who should be involved in that decision. So with this, I have made recommendations to Europeana, which you can read in the final section, but it's really about supporting the sector and creating some harmonization through practice, through guidance about the application of licenses, tools, and labels to 3D models, and trying to work that in through the licensing framework and also the data system fields. Okay, on to you, Marietta.
Thanks, Andrea. Yes, Marietta.
Thanks so much, and brilliant work on that report. This was just what we needed, because there's been a lot of lack of clarity for this question about does more rights arise when we use all this technology to scan, and with the different angles around the sculpture, etc. So it's important clarification for all of us. So I've been invited to give a little case study into SMK's 3D adventures, and I'm really happy to be able to do that. So let's get cracking. Next slide, please. Just a short introduction to SMK. We're the National Gallery of Denmark. Our collection spans Western art from late medieval to the present. We have approximately 500,000 visitors a year to our museum in Copenhagen. The collection consists of around 200,000 artworks. And out of that collection, approximately 66% is in the public domain, which has given us a lot of opportunity to play with it over the years. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you a map of Denmark and where we're situated in the capital of Copenhagen. But since we're the National Gallery, we have an obligation to be available for everyone in the country. And that's why we have, for many years, invested so much in digitization and open access. So next slide, please. So for instance, with our map of Denmark with artworks in our collection placed on the map where their locations are. This is one way of showing that we are actually available all over the country. And this is just one example of how we try to visualize that. And the realization coming from a map like this gives us the impetus to really try and act by the facts here. Next slide, please. So this is why we think of digitization as a democratizing practice. A really good colleague of ours, Lizzie Jongma, who used to be the data manager at the Rijksmuseum, said in a report for Europeana many years ago that there is not a single physical space where all our heritage can be shown, but on the internet you can. Next slide, please. And another layer of this realization for us has been to dedicate ourselves as a national gallery to not only digitize to make available, but also to catalyze new creativity in users. Next slide, please. So we've been trying to dedicate ourselves to open access since 2012, where we did our first iteration of open licensing with a small sample of the collection using CC BY. That helped us learn and harvest experience of how that panned out in the public, and it really reassured us that nothing fatal happened. On the contrary, the public were doing all kinds of great things with the open access collection. So that reinsured us to change our image licensing policy overall in 2015 for the entire digitized collection, so that everything is labeled public domain unless it's still under copyright. It's pretty simple, actually. So aligning ourselves with the societal obligation as National Gallery. And then, thanks to the CDSM Directive Article 14, which was implemented not until 2023 in Danish law, now this is being established as common practice in Denmark. Next slide, please. So just to give you a feel of how we put this into practice, this is our online collection called SMK Open. Next slide, please. Here I've made a search for melancholy with photo, free to use. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show you an example of, even before we did 3D digitization, how new creative products could arise out of the digitized artworks, also in 2D. So here is an example from a jewelry design contest that we did in partnership with Shapeways a couple of years ago, where an Italian design company took cues from this public domain painting from the 16th century to create a beautiful 3D printed necklace. Next slide, please. Which was the winning design of the contest. So just one small example of how public domain art that we give away for free can be turned into products that can be traded in the museum store, as we did with these beautiful designs. Next slide, please. Then a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to start including 3D models in our collection data as well through a partnership with Scan the World. We've had Jonathan Beck visit SMK a number of times, allowing us to publish around 400 3D scans of sculptures in our collection. A lot of them being plaster casts, so already it's copies of originals. it's analog surrogates, you can say, and now we also have the digital surrogates of those. Next slide, please. So in our online collection, you can tick the box with 3D, and you get a lot of public domain, free to use 3D scans in super high quality. Next slide, please. And they are being used creatively. Here's an example of still from a short film by Italian. We have a lot of Italians being creative with our collection, apparently. Lucio Arrese, who did this beautiful short film called Les Dieux Changeants in 2021, The Gods Are Changing, where he used these mythological figures that are so well known and famous from Greek and Roman antiquity, and with ingenious creative work, turned them into this really, really powerful film that I encourage you to look up and watch. Next slide, please. And a lot of people have been watching this short. It has won a lot of awards in festivals all over the world. And because Lucio Arrese, he contacted us when he made the film and said, hey, do you want to see this? I used your 3D scans. And we were like, yeah, sure, send it along. And we just thought it was such a brilliant movie. And we have been also featuring it at SMK on numerous occasions. And because of this exchange between, you know, the art institution hosting the originals and an artist out there in the world using the 3D scans, there's just been such a nice synergy. So he has really also featured SMK very much in his communication about this film, bringing a lot of renewed attention from artistic communities to the possibilities in the 3D scans and models that we host. So this is really, a butterfly effect. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to just draw attention to another 3D scan we have that has garnered a lot of attention. It is not the famous Little Mermaid by Edvard Eriksen in Copenhagen, which is a huge tourist attraction here, because it is under copyright, which is being strictly enforced by the estate until in a couple of years, where it will expire. Next slide, please. But there's another mermaid based on the same fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. This is by a woman artist, Anne-Marie Carl Nielsen. She died in 1945, so her sculpture is in the public domain. And if you go to the next slide, we also have a bronze statue of the mermaid in our collection, which has been 3D scanned by Scan the World. Next slide, please. And this was our contribution to the Twin It campaign Europeana ran to garner attention around the potentials in 3D scanning of cultural heritage. And it has gotten a lot of visibility through this campaign. So for instance, being on the landing page of the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage. Next slide, please. And we're now starting to explore our 3D models as commercial products as well, in collaboration with Scan the World and their printing service, My Manufacturing, where we're now testing like scans of these sculptures to become souvenirs or accessories you can buy in the museum shop and also online. Next slide, please. We have a huge exhibition on Michelangelo coming up next year, and this will be the real test bed for putting 3D scans of the plastic casts in our collection into like really desirable models that you can buy and take home as a great souvenir of the exhibition. So again, just underpinning what Andrea said about, you know, open licensing is not the end of business for you. It's just making the models available for everyone because it is our shared cultural heritage. This is part of our obligation, but that does not inhibit the museum itself from thinking creatively about developing new business models. Next slide. So that was all from me. And if you have questions or comments or anything, please get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Merete, and thank you also, Andrea. So yes, over to all of you who have been listening. Any questions, thoughts, challenges, doubts, or examples that you would like to share with everyone else? I'm curious to know if there's anyone working directly with 3D digitization and has had any of these type of conversations before.
While people get their courage up, something popped in my head while Merete was presenting, which is super nerdy and very fascinating from a copyright perspective that other people might enjoy. So she mentioned, of course, that there's a lot of interest from Italians, right? Artists, people who are looking to reuse the collections that SMK holds. And this is where we start to see how important like policy and law becomes in directing that interest. Because in Italy, there's a cultural heritage code, which we discuss in the paper, that actually requires people who are using even a reproduction, an image, a photograph, anything that depicts an object that is owned and held by a public institution in Italy requires them to get permission and pay a fee if it's for commercial use, okay? So when we think about artists and creating new works, you may not go straight to that's commercial use, that individual should be paying, you know, Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence, right? But that's the impact of that specific law. It means that individuals are actually going to collections outside of where they may be located because of the laws that will apply in that country. And of course, you know, there's other laws and other sorts of things that will crop up and arise, but that is then, you know, to SMK's benefit, right? Because they're the source of all this great high resolution data and starting to see returns in ways that aren't directly related to the copyright license of something they may not have and don't have copyright in the first place. You know, so it's this brand licensing, it's this indirect revenue, and it's the wider value that gets created for the institution, the visibility of the collection. And this is like the real utility of 3D models and open licenses and public domain tools for them.
Thanks, Andrea. Quick question for Merethe in the chat is well, I think you're saying it, yeah.
Yeah, why don't I just respond in here? SMK is not free to enter. It was for 10 years. It was a political decision to open up the physical collections of SMK as the National Gallery of Art and the National Museum of Culture in Cultural History in Copenhagen. It was open like that for 10 years. Then there was a political decision to reinstate paid entrance to those museums. It has been kind of a what's it called? I forget the word right now.
Yeah. Roller coaster.
Roller coaster, thank you. But to me, who has been working through the whole period on digital open access, that just makes the digital availability even more important, since it's not free for all to access the original artworks.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. And there's also a comment by Nancy on the free-to-use tag that you use instead of the public domain mark, that she finds it useful. Yeah, and this is a conscious decision on our side to both use like a small symbol with the copyright symbol with like a strike through, but also to just label it with a clear, like a language that everyone will be able to read. Even so, I get mails daily from people who use our online collection asking, is it really free to use also for this and that purpose? So I think because we have been so restrictive as a sector for so many generations, there is now a transition time where we need to unlearn what we've been saying to the public for many years, that you cannot touch, you have to ask permission, etc. You have to buy, you have to, so it will take some time. Mm-hmm. Noted. There's some follow-up on your comments. Oh, I'm behind. If John or Nancy, you'd like to speak up, feel free to do that as well. But otherwise, we can also follow up in the chat. So, yeah, John says, so it is the opposite of copyright. The copies are free, but the originals are not. Well, access to the originals isn't. And Nancy, presumably the same originality requirements will apply to, sorry, what is CT? Well, scan 3D models, for example, as well as surface scan 3D objects. I'm not sure either about CT. Well, Nancy, if you want to clarify, okay. Oh, medicals.
Internal. Oh.
I also wanted to ask, Merete, could you tell us just a little bit about Scan the World and My Mini Factory, how they work?
Yes, we were approached by Jonathan Beck from Scan the World. Actually, we know each other for a long time through the Europeana network, and they knew that we had this open access policy on our two-dimensional photos of artworks in the public domain. And they approached us to ask if, if they came with the equipment, could they get access to 3D scan at SMK? We were just so happy to get that suggestion, because we had very few 3D scans by Sketchfab from a specific project, just a pilot project. But we hadn't worked in larger scale with that part of the collection before. And it happened to coincide with, because of budget cuts and austerity, the actual closing down, or closed access to the Plastercast collection, which is in a different building in Copenhagen. And it used to be open a couple of days a week, but we couldn't afford anymore to have guards and security there. So in fact, this physical collection of the Plastercasts is now not available to the public. So that made it even more urgent to get the digitized copies out of there, so that the public could gain access to this part of the collection. It's an important study collection, and there are a lot of these classical sculptures also from, for instance, from Italy, that cannot be accessed as 3D models because of restrictive policies in the original country. But we have these copies that are often 100, 120 years old. So they're in very good condition, often in better, they show a better condition than the original marbles that are perhaps placed outside or in churches, etc., in Italy somewhere, in Greece, because they have been going through, the 20th century pollution, and wars, etc. So it's an important study collection, and suddenly it was unavailable. So we are super, super happy about this collaboration with Scan the World. And the only thing, the transaction has been that they would gain access to the 3D scans, to make the 3D scans, which is their business. And we would be able to, give that access. So it has not been a money transaction between us. It has been like a mutual exchange of benefits. Of course, we've been paying for John's travel and stay and per diem, etc. But that's it.
Super. I think that kind of answers the question that Ellen just dropped in the chat, and Andrea followed up. Okay. So the institution can apply whichever reuse conditions they want. Okay.
So, and this is Sketchfab, and with Scan the World, and there's also like a buffet of licensing options. And we were, I believe, among the very first of their partners who insisted on public domain labeling. And they actually had to introduce that label because we were like, if we're going to do this, we need to put this in the public domain. Yeah, because
Nice.
that was already our policy for 2D.
Super. Any additional questions? People feel free to unmute and speak up or drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I've got another one. We've just got 5 minutes left. Also about the practical side of things, Merete, do you have information about how people have been using the models other than when they directly approach you with like an awarded movie?
Yeah, that's kind of the challenge with open licensing, because in the good old days where people had to like apply to get access to your the reproductions from your collection, you wouldn't know who used it. Now that it's just online and shareable, it's all over the place, and it's impossible to control. It's not that we have a desire to control it either, but of course we're interested in tracking and knowing how what's the benefits of putting all of this content out there. We don't have a complete overview, no, but we can clearly see that because of the generous gesture, which is also, of course, embedded in law of sharing this openly, there are a lot of people who come back to us and say, we're very happy about the access we're gaining to this content, and we're using it for this and that. And that way we keep sort of a record of what it's being used for.
Okay.
But we have to guess that it's being used much more than we can ever.
Of course, yeah.
Ismo is asking, how are you sharing the master models to those interested to use them? What do you mean by master models? The plaster casts or the 3D scans?
Actually, the high resolution models.
Yeah,
best model.
They are available on My Mini Factory.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So there's a link from SMK Open, the online collection, where we have in order to to balance our bandwidth, we don't share the biggest available. It's technical. I wouldn't be able to explain it completely, but the big file is with My Mini Factory, and we also have those, but it's not the one you meet in our online collection. We also have the masters as an archive in our database. Another thing, if I may just clarify, because we were using CC0 as the label before Article 14 was implemented in Danish law, because back then there was a photographic right that we had to waive. So photos, also digital reproductions, faithful reproductions, were protected 50 years after the photo was taken. But with the implementation of Article 14 last year, we changed our labeling to the public domain mark, because we realized that now there's no right to waive.
Super. Thank you so much. I think to me that's been really insightful and clear. I wanted to thank you both, Merete and Andrea, for your time, and Andrea especially for this very insightful report. I'm dropping the link in the chat for anyone interested in looking at the many very interesting findings in the document. And for those who after this will have lots of questions and would like to have another conversation, maybe a non-recorded one, more informal one, we're going to do a session of the Europeana Copyright Community office hours in about a month. So if you're on the Europeana Copyright channels, you'll be receiving a link to register, and it will be just an informal chat to discuss some of the topics that might interest you, concern you, etc. So thank you all for your participation, and wishing you all a great afternoon.